for you to make your case both for and against. We ask you to do so civilly. We know you disagree, so please engage with each other. Please don't talk over your opponents, but feel free to rebut or respond or amplify things that you hear said. We want engagement between the yes and the no side. And we'll have some questions, and feel free to ask your opponents questions if we haven't asked the question that you think we should have. We'll get started with the proponents of the measure. If each of you gentlemen could introduce yourselves so our massive viewing audience knows who you are and which side you're on, then we'll ask the proponents to make their case first, and we'll have the no side then respond to that. Start at this end of the table.
I'm Paul Don Hefner. I'm the Legislative Committee Chairman for the Oregon Hunters Association.
Okay.
Paul Shively. I volunteer with the Yes on 114 campaign.
Okay.
John Hummel, Deschutes County District Attorney. I'm in support of 114.
Okay. Kevin?
My name is Kevin Sheridan with the Oregon Firearms Federation. I'm sorry, gentlemen, I didn't get your names.
Yeah, I'm Nigel Jaquist, news reporter.
I'm Lucas Manfield, also a reporter.
Thank you.
All right, so the proponents, let's have you, since you brought this measure, let's have you take a couple minutes to tell us what the measure would do and why it's a good idea.
All right, I'll go first. I was elected to keep Oregonians safe, and it's not working right now. What we're doing isn't working. People in mental health crisis are able to buy firearms and hurt themselves or others. People with domestic violence convictions are able to buy firearms and hurt people that they've hurt before. This is because of the 48-hour loophole in our gun purchasing system. Mass shootings kill more people when high-capacity magazines are used, and we allow large-capacity magazines in Oregon. Measure 14 is reasonable, it's targeted, it's lawful, and it's a measure that will save lives. That's why I support it.
Could you be a little bit more specific? There are a couple of sort of major components of the measure for people who aren't familiar with it. Could you tell us briefly what it would actually do?
Yeah, there's two major pieces. One is let's call it the permit to purchase. It requires people who want to purchase a firearm to obtain a permit prior to purchasing it. The other component is a ban on large capacity magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. So the permit to purchase piece, I'll talk about that first. Okay, someone wants to buy a firearm. They have to go to a local law enforcement agency to obtain a permit. What do they have to do to get that permit? Well, one, pay a fee to the law enforcement agency. That fee cannot exceed $65. Two, they have to present photo ID. Three, they have to be fingerprinted. The police will do a background check on that person. If they're, banned by, federal and state law from purchasing a gun, they won't get their permit. Domestic violence conviction, felony, etc. They have to provide proof that they completed a gun safety program. And the law enforcement officer who is issuing that permit will assess whether that person is a danger to themselves or others, whether they're presenting as someone who is in a mental health crisis. And if all those things meet with the local law enforcement officer's approval, the permit is issued. It has to be issued within 30 days of application, and it's valid for 5 years. And then once that person has that permit, anytime within that 5 years, they can go to a local gun dealer to buy a gun. They have to present their permit. And now when they present that permit, for the most part, everything is the same as now, with one major exception. So they present that permit, that gun dealer has to do a criminal background check, to determine if someone has a domestic violence history, if they've been committed, if they have a felony conviction, all the things that apply now. But right now, if that business owner or if the FBI background check system is backed up and they can't complete that background check within 48 hours, the person has to be allowed to buy a gun. This removes that 48-hour loophole. This says you cannot purchase your gun until that background check is completed. So that's kind of the changes for the purchasing end of things. And the other one is more direct. It's the magazine capacity. No more magazines that hold more than 10 rounds can be manufactured or sold in Oregon. There's a grandfather clause in there for what to do with current magazines that exceed that capacity.
Just to be clear, when you say purchase a gun, you're talking about any gun, regardless of whether it's a small shotgun that would just be used for hunting birds?
Correct.
So any gun?
Any gun, yeah, firearm. Yeah.
Great, okay. For the no side, please.
If I may, just, one other aspect. So I started volunteering with Measure 114, largely because I've been a gun owner my whole life. I grew up in a small town. Hunting has been a big part of my life. It still is. I have a concealed weapon license permit, or license. And I just felt very strongly that so often you hear from the gun owner side just that any regulations are just a slippery slope towards taking our guns away. And I think there's a vocal, or there's a silent majority of gun owners out there, like me, that feel we have to do our part, that it's time to be part of the solution to this unparalleled amount of violence that we see in Oregon and across the nation. So I'm not worried as a gun owner that this is a slippery slope. I know I will always be able to own my guns. I will have to go through a couple more steps, but my constitutional rights to own a gun will always be there. And so I am not the least bit worried that, in fact, I think it's just the responsible thing to do as a lifetime gun owner to have better measures in place.
Okay. Paul or Kevin, either of you?
Yeah, I'd like to respond. There are a couple of things that I need to correct. First of all, one of the speakers said that domestic violence, people with domestic violence convictions can get guns. They can't do it legally. I mean, they can do it on the black market, but they're currently prohibited from doing that. The second thing is, there's no transfer in 48 hours. That's not correct. The law says that if the police don't do their job and complete a background check after 3 business days have transpired, which means if you initiate the background check on Monday, then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday have to transpire, and theoretically, you could take possession of the gun on Friday. In fact, that virtually never happens. It's not actually a loophole, it's a safeguard if the police don't do their job, which currently they're not doing. So I hear from people every single day, some of them are waiting 2 years to have their background checks completed. And in many cases, background checks aren't even initiated, sometimes for weeks, because although the state police are by law required to initiate the background check, they very often simply don't. They put you in a queue of up to 7,000 people, and the background check doesn't even begin, so the people aren't even technically being delayed. But in reality, firearms transfers on delays virtually never happen because dealers are terrified to do it. They have been threatened by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They've been lied to by the state police. They've been told they're liable if they do the transfer. The alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agents will say, yes, it is technically legal, but we will find a way to shut you down if you do it. I know no dealer that will transfer a firearm. And in fact, one of the things that demonstrates this is true, is that we frequently hear from people who say, hey, I've been waiting 4 months, 5 months, the state police won't call me back. I have nothing in my history that explains this. Can't we do a lawsuit? And the reason we can't do a lawsuit is because if you go to court and say, look, the police are not obeying the law, they're not doing what the law states they must do, the courts are in a position to say, well, wait a minute, this is the dealer's fault, because the dealer has the legal right to transfer the gun, which is true, they have the legal right to transfer the gun, but in fact, they never ever do it. And because, as I said, they're afraid, they're told that they're liable, and in fact, of course, everybody's liable for everything all the time. But the reality is that it is not a loophole. It's a safeguard against the failure of the state to conduct the check that they're supposed to conduct, which in fact they're not conducting. And in reality, there is simply no way to comply with this law. If I'm forced to get a permit, and by the way, I should point out that as of Monday, the Supreme Court reversed another law in Massachusetts that required permits, vacated and sent to the lower courts because they need all of these issues to resolve in light of the Bruen decision. And the people who promoted the measure have said that their lawyers looked at it and there were permits in other states, and that was true when they wrote the measure. But after Bruen, the entire landscape has changed, and in fact, many cases have been vacated and remanded. We have an amicus briefs in on about a half a dozen of them, and it's not only permit cases, it's magazine cases, it's semi-automatic rifle cases. So our belief is that it's 100% unconstitutional. That may not matter now. That'll be decided by the courts at great expense and a lot of time. But the fact is that it is not going to be physically possible under almost any circumstances for anyone to comply with this because the resources do not exist to provide the classes. In addition to that, you're going to ask people, let's take a perfect example, take the minority community in Portland, which I think most people will agree does not have a very good relationship with the police. There's a lot of mistrust there. Now what we've done is said what the Supreme Court has determined is absolutely an individual right, whether other people like that or not, the court has said that, is now subject completely to the discretion of a police department that you may not trust. And in fact, the classes that are required by this measure can only be offered by either police or police authorized people, and there's no place to do it. And on top of that, while the proponents say the permit only costs $65, there's no cap whatsoever on the cost for the class. And where will this class be given? If you're in Portland, where do you go to take a live fire class? And who's authorized to give it? Because not only do they have to give a live fire class, live fire or what? If you want to buy a shotgun, are you taking a live fire class with a handgun? There are no facilities to do it. In fact, for miles around my home, all of the police train at my club. They have no facilities of their own. My police department has made it clear they have no ability to comply with this, and the sheriffs we've spoken to all over the state have also said they can't comply with it, they can't offer the classes, and they don't have the means to provide the permits. And all the permit is not permission to buy a gun. The permit, if you can jump through all these other hurdles, which we believe is impossible, all it is a permit to ask for a third background check. So you get the background check through the local police or the sheriff. They request that the state police conduct a background check, which the state police in many cases simply are not doing anymore. Then if by some chance you manage to get the permit, all that allows you to do is request yet another background check, which literally could take forever. Which
Kevin, let me slow.
Inconvenience to me.
Okay, let me slow you down just for a minute because I know we've got a lot of ground to cover here. So I think you've been very clear in your objections there. Could you or Paul address the second component of the measure, the large capacity magazine part of the measure? Then we'll have some further discussion.
Sure. The large capacity thing is really problematic. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has already vacated a California law which bans large capacity magazines, and that covers Oregon as well. The Ninth Circuit does. So that's one of the things that's probably more unconstitutional than some of the other aspects of it.
So help
probably be struck down. But the large capacity thing, it's 10 rounds or more, which would outlaw most commonly owned handguns today. There's many models of handgun that exceed 10 rounds as a factory standard round. The Glock 17, for example, the 17 stands for 17 rounds. That's the capacity of it. The Glock 19 is 19. There are a number of other standard issue handguns that regularly exceed 10 rounds, and they'd all be banned on this for self-defense and other purposes. The other thing with there is a provision in the measure that allows you to keep a pre-existing magazine if you can prove that you owned it before passage of the measure. But that's going to be virtually impossible unless you carry around a book full of receipts for
Well, you
everything.
take a picture of the newspaper and put your Glock 19 next to it with today's date on it.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Is that,
okay.
you know, does that count?
Well, let's say
The thing
going-
is with magazines, there's no date stamp on the magazine.
Right.
There's no born before date
Right.
on the magazine. And so people
Yeah.
are left in this quandary of, you know, am I legal with it or not?
Let's assume for a second that you could overcome that problem, that you could prove that your pre-existing gun with a larger magazine
Right.
was legal. What's the case for going forward, starting next year or whenever, why you would need a capacity of more than 10?
Well, I already mentioned many of the handguns have over 10.
But there are plenty that do not, aren't there?
There are guns with less than 10, but there are many commonly popular handguns exceed 10. Moreover, many people use large capacity magazines for varmint hunting with a 17 caliber rifle or a 22 caliber rifle. You can get a larger capacity magazine for those, and you can use them to shoot varmints or for target practice or just recreational shooting in general. And so while most hunters don't use a large capacity magazine for big game, it's not necessary. There are other situations where people use them just for sport shooting. And so that would all be for naught. And some of the exceptions in there don't include going out on public lands and doing target shooting.
Okay. D.A. Hummel, I saw you had your hand raised on a couple of occasions.
Yeah, thank you. You asked Kevin before he started talking to address the issue of people with a domestic violence conviction being able to purchase. Legally, you cannot purchase, but if the background check is not completed in the lawful amount of time, the seller can sell. And then cryptically throughout that talk, he did acknowledge that, but then he said it never happens. Why would they ever do it? Well, talk to the family members of the people in the church in Charleston who were slaughtered a few years ago because of this very situation. The background check was not completed in time, and so the seller sold the gun. Sellers do sell throughout Oregon and throughout this county when the background check is not completed in a timely manner.
I don't think so.
Can you name one?
I just did.
No seller in Oregon that is doing it, because I have looked and I
Right.
had trouble, so I was just wondering, like,
Yeah.
can you name a seller?
Well, I'll talk to the campaign and we'll try to get that to you. But it absolutely can happen, and it has happened in this country. I know that. And so let's flip back. Well, we know it can happen, and we know it has happened. Why would you want it to happen? Right? And now I know Kevin will never support, his group's position is an absolutist group that will never support any regulations. I respect that, so we know why he wouldn't. But if you are a reasonable gun owner who supports some gun regulations and is opposed to others, why would you not support this one? Why would you want someone with a domestic violence conviction to be able to buy a gun? I don't want them to. And right now, the law allows them to if a background check is not completed in the required time. This would change that. So that was one thing I wanted to talk.
But to back up Kevin, technically, they can transfer it, but as a matter of fact, they don't. And I think you'd be hard pressed to go out and find a gun dealer that would actually transfer after 3 days.
Well,
I myself have gone to Cabela's and had to wait, a couple of weeks sometimes or more. You can stand there and shout all you want. It's time to give it to me, and they're not going to hand it over. It's just not going to happen. That's just, and if we wanted to address that particular thing surgically somehow, that would be a different matter. But this is a much broader measure that, comes up with this whole new scheme of this permit to purchase, classes, live fire, things that are going to be virtually impossible to jump through. And that's why the Oregon State Sheriff's Association has come out in opposition to this thing, because it's going to cost them millions and millions of dollars that it's going to take from other police resources or from mental health programs, other local government things. The fiscal on this thing is one of those unintended consequences that's just horrible. It's just horrible.
Okay, now.
And the proponents didn't provide funding for it. They provided a $65 fee for the thing, And of the $65 fee, most of that goes to the for the background checks that the state police conduct. There's only like $18 left over for local government to actually cover their costs. So the fiscal on this thing is one of those unintended consequences that really needs to be teased out for the public. I think they need to understand that it's just not right to submit a measure to the public and not provide any means of funding the thing.
Go ahead.
Okay, all right, let's break some things down here. Okay, there's burdensome, impossible to comply with. Right now we have a very similar process that exists. It's the process to get a permit to carry a concealed weapon. You have to go to your local sheriff, you have to apply, you have to pay a fee, there's a background check. That happens now in every jurisdiction. There's a difference with this, right? Two added things with this. One, you have to complete a demonstration that you can safely fire a gun. It is not a live fire requirement. Absolutely not. It is not a live fire requirement. You have to demonstrate that you can safely shoot a gun. You can do that through dry fire demonstration. Dry fire is, my gun owning friends know about dry fire. It's showing that you know how to load the gun, you know how to operate the safety, you know how to pull the trigger. You can do that, and law enforcement officers know how to conduct dry fire training. So that's the added piece. And there's one other added piece, and I think this is important. Right now, if you go to Walmart to buy a gun, the gun owner, the store owner, or the clerk, as we talked about, has to run your criminal background check to see if you're excluded for all the reasons you can be excluded. They don't do a visual on you to assess whether they think you might be a danger. This permit to purchase, the sheriff's deputy or police officer who's looking at you is assessing whether you are somebody who might be in a mental health crisis. And if you are, they're not going to issue that permit. That's a key piece right now that's missing. So it's that assessment of whether you're in the mental health crisis, and that's different than the concealed carry permit. And there is this you have to demonstrate that you can safely operate a firearm, which seems reasonable to me, and that's that you don't have to, if there's a law enforcement officer who wants to do live fire, that's fine, but dry fire is allowed.
So we passed a
But
red
this says
flag.
this says fire. This doesn't
You have
say
to demonstrate that you are able to safely do it.
lock,
It doesn't
load,
say you have
lock,
to do
load,
it.
fire.
You have to demonstrate that you can do that. You don't have to do that.
I want to ask you about the condition that a deputy is going to assess somebody's
Right.
safety.
Yeah.
So we've had a red flag law in this state
Right.
for 5 years.
Right.
Relatively few people have been prohibited from buying guns under that law, right?
Well, it's not a prohibition to buying guns if you
Right,
have it. Right. Gotcha.
right.
Yeah.
So are you really convinced that deputies around the state are, first of all, are they trained to do that, and will they
Right.
do that?
Well, first off, kind of proud of this. Deschutes County uses the red flag law more than any other county in the state. So and I have a officer who works in my office who trains officers in Deschutes County about the red flag law. That's why it's used more in our county. But one, you would definitely need training. But also, this is a situation where I say you have to err on the side of safety, because there's an immediate appeal allowed to circuit court. So if you're denied that appeal, you can go right into circuit court, and it's an expedited appeal. The circuit court has to make a decision in a relatively short period of time. I think it's 30 days, but I'd have to look in here.
So could you also address the objections that your opponents have raised? First, they've raised, I'm not a lawyer, neither is Lucas, but they've raised legal objections saying that essentially the Supreme Court has put our ability to enforce this permitting system in doubt. And they've also raised the objection that a ton of Oregon firearm owners already own something that's got a capacity of over 10 rounds. So.
Well, on the capacity, I'll leave to Paul, but on the legal side, right now, first off, we have 15 states have permit to purchase laws right now, and 10 states have magazine capacity laws, and the laws are challenged all the time, right? We expect challenges, but right now, as my hunter friends know, there's a magazine capacity limit for hunters, and that's been the case. That's the law in Oregon now, and that's that has, or if it's been challenged, it's been upheld, but it's the law now. And so look, the Supreme Court has never said we can't have gun safety regulations. They've said there's limits, right? And this is a focused law that does not deny people from owning weapons if you don't have a domestic violence conviction, felony conviction. It ensures that people who own guns are going to own guns safely. People who have guns are people who should be allowed to have guns. You don't need 15 rounds to defend your home or go hunting. You can't legally hunt with 15 round magazines right now.
Maybe you can just specifically.
Well, hold just, Kevin, can you hold just one sec?
I was just saying, do you know the laws that got struck down in Massachusetts and California? And
I'm not familiar with those, no, and I don't accept that. That's true, but I don't deny it. I just am not familiar with it.
So as a hunter, the magazine capacity is 5 for long rifle, 2, 3 for a shotgun. My ability to hunt doesn't change by high capacity magazines. Can I carry my Walther PPQ on a street with a 15 round clip now, or a magazine? No, and I shouldn't be able to. When I purchased that Walther, it came with 3 high capacity magazines. And I think, if this measure is passed, I think it's a pretty strong mandate that Oregonians will not want to see people carrying a magazine that can, above 10. You just don't need it. It's just common sense that you don't need it. I will still be able to use that at a firing range. I will still be able to have it at my house for home defense. The gun isn't banned, and I'm not criminalized for having it, but can I carry it out in the public? No, and I probably shouldn't be able to.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I've been informed that Miles Pendleton is actually waiting in the waiting room.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to just try and see him.
Yeah, Kevin, one sec. We're just going to let somebody else into the Zoom room, and then your turn to talk.
Okay.
Hello, Mr. Pendleton?
No, that's it.
Anthony Johnson.
Oh, I'm sorry. You must have. I'm sorry. This is the
No, he's right. He's the right guy.
Oh, he is.
No. Miles Pendleton is who we're looking for, unless he's not on there.
Isn't Anthony 114?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well,
He
then-
is. I think he's just
But
probably
Miles
watching.
Pendleton
Is NAACP? Would that be Miles?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Got it. Sorry.
Yeah, there it is.
Did Paul Shively make it in person?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're here and I'm here.
Can everyone hear? Okay.
Miles is muted.
Oh.
Or maybe he's sending.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, Kevin, go ahead. Sorry about the delay.
That's okay. Listen, let's be clear here. The ballot measure unequivocally, undeniably calls for firing of a firearm. Now,
No, it
you
doesn't.
could suggest that dry fire would be acceptable, but that would make no sense under the statute, under the bill, because it specifically says that the requirement to lock, load, fire, and fire a gun can be done separately from the rest of the class, which could be handled online. If this could be completed with a dry fire exercise, which we believe it clearly cannot, why would you have to separate it from an online class? I mean, I could demonstrate live fire here in my office safely, a dry fire safely here in my office with an empty gun. There's no question that the people who created this measure intended it to be a firing of a live round, and the question is, firing of what kind of live round? A handgun, a shotgun? So I think if you actually read the measure, you cannot deny what it calls for and what would be expected of it. As for the capacity of magazines, I simply don't understand who got the magical ability to know what a person would need in terms of capacity of a firearm. Hunting regulations have nothing to do with this. There's no constitutional right to hunt. So hunting regulations have always existed, and yes, there are limits on the capacity of hunting rifles. What we're talking about are constitutional issues that, in fact, whether the previous speaker knows it or not, these have all been vacated, many of them vacated and remanded to lower courts. That is happening right now. And anyone who does any legal research can see that instantly.
Okay?
A question, I wanted to follow up on something that was discussed earlier. I didn't want to interject, but the question of how are we going to handle the grandfathering of large capacity magazines.
Yep.
Large capacity magazines can still be manufactured and sold for police agencies, so large capacity magazines are allowed for that. So if large capacity magazines are made after the effective date of this, they have to be stamped with the indication that they were manufactured after the effective date, pursuant to this law. So if you have a large capacity magazine that without that stamp, we're going to assume that you got it beforehand. And if there's someone who's manufacturing these magazines without putting that stamp on it, they will be prosecuted.
You said, I think earlier...
That's only in Oregon. These are manufactured all over the country, and in fact, they're unregulated all over the country. So if I want a large capacity or standard capacity magazine, which is what they are, and they're outlawed in Oregon, I drive across the border to Idaho, or I get one of the millions that are in circulation now, which are completely unregulated, have no serial numbers, and there's no way to track it all. They're not regulated in other parts of the country. Nothing prevents me from walking into a Cabela's in Idaho and buying as many as I want.
That's right.
So I want to, just before we get to you, Paul, I want to ask, the yes side has said that there are 15 states that have a permitting system and 10 that have magazine capacity limits. So is the measure patterned on a state where both are currently in place?
And could you ask?
Well, I'm trying to, we always want to know, okay, you're bringing a new idea. Where is this idea actually in place, legal, and functional right now?
Well, if this measure passes, which we believe it will, then we will really come in line with the laws in Oregon and California. So the whole West Coast will be along
You mean in Washington?
I'm sorry, yes, Washington and California. So the whole West Coast will be more similarly aligned. I can't say that it's identical, but you basically would then have the West Coast having very similar rules.
So do you agree with that?
No, there's no permit to purchase in Washington that I'm aware of. There's no permit to purchase in California that I'm aware of. And certainly not Idaho or Nevada.
Hold on a second.
And that's another impact of this thing, is that people will travel out of state if this thing comes, if this permit to purchase comes and it's impossible to get it, or nearly impossible, or just too much of a trouble. People will travel across state lines to get them. And when they do that, the federal excise tax that is paid for on firearms and ammunition will go to those other states. Currently, that tax comes back to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife for wildlife conservation programs. And it's millions and millions of dollars every year that comes to Oregon off those excise taxes. So every time we drive people out of the state to buy, the taxes will go to those other states, and Oregon loses. It's another one of the unintended consequences of this measure that no one really talks about a whole lot, but it does hurt conservation funding. The other thing with conservation funding, all the nonprofits like Oregon Hunters, Rocky Mountain Elk, DU, hold banquets and fundraisers throughout the year and throughout the state, and they frequently raffle off firearms, shotguns, and other things like that. If you go to one of those and you don't have one of these permits to purchase, you're not going to be able to participate in those kinds of banquets and raffles and fundraisers. So it's really going to be a huge crippling effect for those nonprofits, and that money goes back to conservation funding too.
Oh.
Well, two responses there, and if I'm not mistaken, and I've actually tried this in both Idaho and Montana as an Oregon resident, I've tried to purchase firearms in those states, and you cannot purchase in a state that you don't live in. If you can, they would have to follow Oregon laws for an Oregon resident. So some of that just isn't true, to the best of my knowledge. And on the raffles, I love the raffles. I have purchased, unfortunately I've never won one, but I've purchased countless raffle tickets for firearms. And if you win, it has to go through a federal firearm licensee anywhere, through a permit. So they again would have to follow. So yes, you would, if you were a winner in the state of Oregon, you would have to follow the laws that voters mandated. But
So if you don't have a permit to purchase, you can't win.
but I
That's not true. You win, and then they're not going to give it to you unless you go get your permit.
Right,
Just
but
like right now, if you win, they have to run a background check on you. It's no different.
Right, you have to run a background
Right.
check on the people.
Let's talk about the background
The
check.
question is, how many background checks does it take to buy a firearm?
Yeah.
Right now,
Can we get?
right now, if you
He's gonna hit me hard
Right
on
now,
this.
Yeah, I
right
really
now,
want to.
right now,
Let him
no, right now, if you have a concealed handgun license, you're thoroughly vetted. You've been background checked out the wazoo. You've been fingerprinted, photographed, the whole shebang. This doesn't give you a pass in terms of purchasing with a concealed handgun license. You still got to get the permit to purchase. Now you got to get another background check for the permit to purchase. And then when you ultimately get to the store and pick out what you want and decide to purchase, you get a third background check. How many background checks is enough to satisfy people that indeed you've done?
Well, I just want to point out, I think we can all agree that state police are taking forever to do these background checks, right? I mean, if you look at the numbers, I mean, do you know what percent of those?
It really depends. It really depends.
But so I mean, guess
If your
what?
name's-
My question is that like why we're just adding to that problem with this. So like why is this really the best way to address this, given that like there are
Well, I'll let John speak to some of the more technical aspects of it, but the difference between the background checks is the permit to purchase is every 5 years. A lot can happen by the time between when you get that permit and when you buy a gun 4.5 years later. You may have been convicted for a domestic violence crime or something of that nature. So the background check that happens at the time of buying would be hopefully catch that. Just anecdotally to the question of, you're being thoroughly vetted when you get your concealed weapons permit, if I may just give you a little run through of when I got mine. I went into a class on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. I sat in the classroom with a lot of other great people. We listened to an instructor until 12:30. We never touched a firearm. We never answered a question. We never took a test. And I walked out with a certificate saying I was okay to go in to the sheriff's office and get my CWL. It was harder for me to get a boater's permit about the same year. It might have been a year or two later. I studied every night for a week to make sure I passed the boater's permit test. For the concealed weapons license, I didn't study an ounce. And after I went to the sheriff's office, now obviously the sheriff's office is doing some work that you don't see in that when you go there, but 3 weeks later I had my concealed weapons license. When I had it renewed, I paid a price, I filled out a form, and I got my renewal.
Now that didn't allow you to buy a gun. Then if you were buying a gun, they'd have to do another background check.
So, okay, Kevin, I want to ask Kevin a question if you don't mind. So Kevin, can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
So you've been involved in debates around various pieces of gun legislation for decades, is my recollection. You've probably seen over that time, if I'm not wrong, the public perception of various mass shootings and the higher crime rates that we've had over the past couple of years sort of galvanized public opinion a little bit against guns. Would you be in favor of any form of additional regulation of firearms above what Oregon law currently calls for? Is there anything that you would propose, or would you say don't change anything, what we have right now is what we should have?
Well, first of all, yes, the public opinion does get galvanized when there's tragedies, but I think you would also recognize that in the last few years, it's been an enormous increase in the purchasing of firearms, and in many cases by communities that had never purchased them before. So gun ownership is actually expanding, and in many cases amongst groups that wouldn't have considered firearms ownership in the past. And that's for many reasons. So I do think that people react as everybody would when they see a horrible tragedy. But no, I actually don't support most of the laws we have now. I would like to see most of those repealed, because clearly, as we've increased the number of regulations, we haven't reduced the violence, so that's not really achieving anything. But I think what's interesting with this measure, and with every measure that the proponents of these people have brought before the legislature, Here's what's never been included. One, the recognition that permits were, perfect example, who was refused a permit by the police? Martin Luther King, after he was attacked and threatened, the police just chose not to give him a permit. So I think that that's significant. I think it's significant that the Oregon Democratic Party refuses to endorse this measure. But what none of these measures ever include is anything that actually holds people accountable who do commit crimes. So most of what we hear as mass shootings are not the things that, like school shootings and mall shootings. Most mass shootings, more than four or more people being shot, are crimes in inner cities with minorities being the victims and the perpetrators. There's not a word in this measure that would address actually holding those people accountable, giving the police tools to actually arrest people, or anything that would require that we prosecute people, which certainly in Oregon we're doing less and less, and in Portland we're doing much, much less. So what I would propose is that we have a system where people who are committing crimes are prosecuted, held accountable, and taken out of the population so they can't hurt people again. So those are the kind of measures I would like to see enforced.
Want to respond to that, D.A. Hummel?
Well, I think he said no, that there's
yes,
no context measure he would ever.
Yes.
All right, I mean, so there's so much there, right? So the opponents of this like the status quo, apparently, I guess, all right, because they're not offering anything to address the status quo. We know 62% more deaths occur at mass shootings with high-capacity magazines. Johns Hopkins estimates that a similar permit-to-purchase law passed in Connecticut lowered the gun death homicide rate by 28% and the gun suicide rate by 33%. And Missouri repealed a permit-to-purchase law. Gun homicides increased by 47%, and the gun suicide rate increased 23%. Regarding the argument that I don't know, prosecutors don't prosecute crimes or something. Well, hey, look, every prosecutor has a different philosophy. We can, prosecutors and I over beers can rib each other about who's soft on shoplifting, or Hummel supports marijuana use, or, this guy over here, isn't tough enough on this. None of us support gun crimes. I'm the most far-left prosecutor in the state. None of my colleagues are going to say Hummel's soft on homicide, Hummel's soft on domestic violence, Hummel's soft on mass shootings. No prosecutor in this state or the country is soft on gun crimes. So the idea that if prosecutors would just be tougher on gun prosecution, we would have less homicides. The data doesn't bear that out. It's a false assertion.
One sec, Paul. Miles, you've been sitting quietly. We haven't heard from you. We're hearing from everybody else. What would you like to add to this discussion?
Certainly. Well, I think just on the point of incarceration also, the idea that incarceration prosecution is going to be the resolution to the violence we're seeing is just simply not true. What we've seen over the last several decades throughout the United States is that as mass incarceration has taken place and as we have prosecuted and incarcerated individuals at a rate never before seen throughout history, violence has not just gone down. That's just not the fact of the matter. So I would really push back against that, and I would really echo, there's never been a shortage of individuals willing to prosecute and to hold accountable people who do commit these acts of violence, especially as it relates to gun violence. When you mentioned urban areas, inner cities, when we especially talk about BIPOC community members who have both perpetuated as well as been the victims of violence, there's never been a shortage of prosecutors who are willing to charge and hold accountable these individuals who commit these acts. So I would really strongly push back on that. And the statistics just don't play out in support of that rhetoric.
Well, Miles, come on. We've seen a secular decline in violent crime in this country from roughly 1990 until about 2 years ago that is dramatic. So I just, those statistics are undeniable that we saw the murder rate, the violent crime rate in this country declined for basically 3 decades.
But again, incarceration occurred before that timeline that you referenced. Mass incarceration began in the 70s. That's when we started prosecuting and putting people in prison and moving towards that model. And so again, it has not played out. The statistics, the scientific facts of the matter. When you look at it, incarceration is not a response to it's not this. It doesn't diminish violence as you reference it. I mean, we see it all the time, and it's been mass incarceration for the last decades, multiple decades.
Okay, what about the specifics of this measure? Anything that you'd like to add to the discussion we've heard so far?
Most certainly. Well, I guess generally, I think now is an opportunity for us, when we talk about equity, right? We talk about action. It's an active endeavor. And so now this is an opportunity where when we talk about gun violence and we talk about the communities that have been impacted by gun violence, this is a prevalent issue that touches every community, every area of our state, every demographic. But certainly when we look at the individuals who are most aggrieved and most damaged and injured by and victimized by this gun violence, it certainly is our Black and BIPOC, otherwise BIPOC, I should say, community members. And so in that regard, when we talk about the status quo, maintaining what currently exists now or petitioning something forward, this measure gives us a foundation to build off of. We talk about all the different areas. We often talk about the metro area and kind of the increasing gun violence that we've seen up there, but certainly even down here in Eugene, when we try to have a march in response to the different acts of racism, bigotry, so on and so forth that we've witnessed, the number one question and concern that we get from our BIPOC community members is how are we going to feel safe even marching? Because we are convinced that guns aren't going to be so prevalent or aren't going to be so rampant amongst those who wish to do us harm that we can't even march. It stagnates that clear process of civic engagement. And so it's a multifaceted issue that we have to consider here. But we also have to look at this and say the status quo disproportionately impacts Black and otherwise minoritized communities. And equity is in this current moment. This measure takes us forward. It gives us a foundation to build off of, and certainly through the implementation process and having these conversations, and not just conversation in a vacuum, but actually taking tangible, active steps towards improving and instilling a new foundation, a new infrastructure of supporting those who have been most historically marginalized. That is a conversation that this measure initiates, begins, and carries forward. It allows that conversation, it allows us to move forward and to do this in an equitable way, because currently what happens right now certainly is not that.
Thank you. What's the magic about 10 rounds? Why did you guys pick that number?
I don't know if there's magic to it, right? Do you?
No.
Right? It could have been 11, 9.
Did you study the sort of existing body of guns that might be in people's hands to Paul's point?
He's our gun expert.
Well, I believe, I wasn't part of the writing, I'm not an author of the measure, but I believe it was in replicating some of the measures and some of the gun laws that other states like Connecticut have in place.
I don't think there's any magic to the number 10. I think they picked it out of the air, and it's just,
there's no magic to it. We can see
it's their number. But I'd like to make another point here, is that you have to get these permit to purchases in the jurisdiction in which you live. So if that's a city, from the chief of police, or if you live in a county, from the county sheriff. But there's nothing in the measure that compels chiefs of police or sheriffs to issue these permits. So, for example, in a city where the chief works for the mayor and the city council, if they tell the chief, no, we don't like guns, we don't want to issue any permits, the chief is kind of like, well, I guess it's like either I walk or I don't issue permits. So there's nothing to compel that. And the other part is that if there's no funding provided for to hiring of the officers and everything else to carry this thing out, if there's no money, there's no permits. No permits, you can't purchase. And the fiscal on this, I think I mentioned it before, it's for the state police, it's going to take 31 new positions that are unbudgeted. Sheriffs require 275 positions unbudgeted. The state cost for the next biennium is over $15 million, and for local governments, it's over $98 million for the next 2 years. And so with the $65 fee generating $19 million a year, the shortfall's on the order of $75 million. If local governments in the state don't pony up to provide the state police and the city police chiefs and the sheriffs, they don't provide them the funding to carry this thing out, there's no permits. Or if they provide them enough to sort of create a little bit of a program, where, you know, take a number and get in line because you're in the queue, but, you know, your number is 2 years out. Ordinary law-abiding citizens are basically denied the right to purchase.
How long have you been active in hunters organizations?
I'm a life member of the Oregon Hunters Association, a life member of Rocky Mountain Elk. I've been on the board for the Oregon Hunters for the last 8 years.
So what's the trend, what's the long-term trend in terms of hunting in Oregon? Number of people, the amount of revenue that's providing ODFW?
It's been declining over time, but they've seen an uptick actually with the pandemic. There was a renewed interest in people going out and sourcing their own food and that, so there's been an uptick in that.
Because ODFW relies on hunters for a lot of its revenue. My impression is that
we pay the bills.
My impression is that over time they've been under a lot of pressure as hunting has declined.
Yeah, it's been under pressure. Fees have gone up, and as I mentioned, the federal excise tax is a big source of funding for the department.
So hunting has been, except for the pandemic, sort of a long-term decline, and gun ownership, as Kevin pointed out earlier, it's really an upswing. So what are people doing with all these guns if they're not hunting with them?
People use them for self-defense. They use them for target shooting. You know, there's a lot of people that like to go out to the range or go out to whatever and go plinking or shooting or whatever. And, you know, it's an important part of family activity for a lot of people to pass on the traditions to their kids. And one of the other things with this in terms of youth hunting is that, you know, people go through hunter education classes, and hunter education classes include gun safety. But that doesn't automatically get you the permit to purchase. There's a provision that says maybe if it's approved. But then you've got to teach the kids about murder and suicide in a hunter education class, which I think is just very inappropriate. I mean, to be trying to talk to 11-year-olds about, oh yeah, we want to talk about hunter safety.
Well, there were two parts here, and I imagine John will probably want to talk about the appeals process that Paul didn't mention, but the unfunded mandate part too, and just the nature of the way measures work. And once you have a mandate by the voters, then it becomes a priority of the legislature and the local governments to adjust their budgets to take care of that. I mean, this idea of unfunded mandates is just not true. I mean, anytime you have the voters say you need to prioritize something, then
well, I mean,
there's a responsibility.
This is a mandate and it's not funded. I think it is the definition of an unfunded mandate.
I disagree. I think it means that there will be some reallocations of money.
Well,
where's it come from?
I honestly don't figure out how this is going to work. I'm not going to lie. Like, how do you think this is going to happen? What do you think? Where did the state?
Wait, please. Here, we do this now very close to this. We have a process where you have to go to the local law enforcement, you have to fill out an application, you have to complete a class, and you get a permit. It's a concealed carry permit.
Police permit?
No, I'm saying concealed carry permit. You go to your local sheriff in all 36 counties, you fill out an application, you have to...
But I'm referring to the state police background check. It's a state police background check that I'm worried about. Like, I just don't understand how they're going to deal with you.
No, I'm saying right now for the concealed carry permit, there's a check on your background. So I'm saying we have a system now that you go to local sheriff, you complete an application, they do a background check, you have to take a class. The difference here is there's another component of the class. You have to demonstrate proficiency in a gun, and we've talked about whether dry firing or not is good. So that's an added piece. But that's it. we have this system. So how are you going to create this whole new complicated system? I get that people who don't want it, that don't like it, okay? But to say that, how would we ever do something like this? We do it now, and we're just saying you also have to get a gun. You have to do that same thing in essence, but you also have to demonstrate proficiency in how to operate a gun. We also have a much more complicated system to demonstrate proficiency in how to operate a very dangerous thing. It's called a driver's license. We have to actually get behind the wheel of your car and demonstrate that you can operate this thing that can kill people. So we're saying you have to demonstrate that you can safely operate a thing that can kill people. We already have that system in place.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. We've got a full schedule of endorsement interviews today. We could spend all day on this issue. It's very interesting. I would like both sides to take 1 minute to wrap up. Yes side, tell us why we should support this. No side, tell us why it's a bad idea. I'll let you guys decide. Just one of you talk for each side. Let's have the no side go first this time because the yes side went first last time. Kevin and Paul, you guys decide.
If I could just wrap this up, the characterization that concealed handgun licenses are very similar to this permitting process is simply not true. It doesn't. The CHL process doesn't involve local police. It allows private instructors to handle this. The mandates that they're talking about simply are not there. The fact is that if you believe that people should not be allowed to own guns, period, this measure is for you. But the undeniable reality is that it will be virtually impossible for most people, particularly poor people in the inner city who have less money and less access to ranges and less trust in the police who now can do any investigation they want. They don't like what you posted on Facebook. They don't like what you said, who your friends are. You're out of luck. It will be a complete bar. It will end youth shotgun shooting because it bans shotguns, almost all shotguns in the state. It's very, very extreme. It's very, very dangerous. And we believe that if people understand what's in it, which they haven't in other ballot measures, they'll recognize that it's way over the top dangerous and has nothing in it that will prevent a single crime or shooting.
Okay. Kevin, just elaborate. I'm going to give you extra bonus time. I missed the part. I read the measure quickly. I missed the part where it bans shotguns. Can you explain that?
Yes, I can. Most shotguns are fed by tubular magazines. Tubular magazines on shotguns are capable of holding more than 10 rounds. If you use a certain type of ammunition called a mini shell, almost every shotgun used in youth competition will fall into the category of having a magazine that's banned because the magazines are integral to the firearm. They're not a separate piece like a pistol magazine that you can remove and replace with a smaller magazine. They can't be removed without tools. Those firearms will no longer be allowed to be sold, and that the safest, most inclusive sport in the state will be decimated.
Thank you. Okay, you guys go ahead, please.
All right. You can buy a gun if you demonstrate you can operate it safely and if you are not dangerous. You can hunt. You can protect your family. You cannot carry large capacity magazines. Guns are the second leading cause of death among children and teenagers. Here's where we are right now. You can support the status quo and vote no on Measure 114, or you can say, we're not accepting it anymore. I support Measure 114. Which one is it? It's not we're not going to choose, right? Measure 114 is good, but it's not great, it's not perfect, so we'll hold off. If you do that, you're choosing the status quo. You're saying the carnage and deaths in Oregon are acceptable to me. The number of kids who are killed by firearms from suicide or homicide, that is acceptable to me. That's what you're saying if you're against this measure. My friends, well, not both of my friends, one of my friends maybe would support some measures. Another one of my friends will support no measures, but my friend who will support another measure is not introducing one. He's not stepping up and saying, this is the measure I support to save lives of children in Oregon. Measure 114 is that measure. It's lawful. it's focused, and it allows hunters to hunt. It allows people to want to protect their families to protect their families. It prohibits people with domestic violence and who are in a mental health crisis from getting a gun. It's good for Oregonians, and it'll save lives. That's why we're supporting it.
Great. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting.
Yeah. I would encourage you to reach out to the OSSA, Oregon State Sheriff's Association.
Yes, other.